Hello, everyone, and welcome to the DAM Workflows from Content Creation to Long-Term Storage webinar. My name is Corey Chimko. I am from Cornell University, where I manage the university photography DAM system. We're part of Cornell's marketing group. So I basically manage assets all day, every day. I have 3 photographers under me. And we're going to talk today about basic DAM workflows. A lot of the questions that I get from people in the industry are about basic DAM workflows, and we're going to try to get through a large part of the process today. I'd also like to invite everybody to contact me, and lastly, I'd also like to invite you to log into the Cornell DAM if that's something that you're interested in. Our DAM is public facing, so basically anyone can log in. So basic DAM workflows, what are we talking about? Basically, here's a pretty basic flow chart of where we start and where we end up, the outline of a basic workflow. Obviously, you're going to start with your content creation, so you're going to have all kinds of people in your establishment creating content. We want to back up that content. We're going to talk about that. We're going to process the content, edit the content. Those two things often go together. Sometimes they're switched one around from the other. We'll talk a little bit about what is entailed there. A big part of the presentation today is going to be talking about metadata, which is always a hot topic. So we're going to talk about different types of metadata application, the pros and cons of each, some standards and best practices for that kind of thing. We'll talk a little bit about DAM ingestion, how you get your assets into your DAM. This can sometimes differ from system to system, but there are some basics we'll go over. Verifying your metadata, which is something that a lot of people kind of skip over, but is actually a very important component that I want to talk a little bit about today. And then how we get basically to asset delivery to your client or whoever it is that you're sending your content to. And now these last 3 are parts of the DAM workflow process that typically occur after an initial project or something is over. That includes repurposing or versioning assets. So basically taking them and using them for purposes that they were not originally intended for, which is a great way to add value to your system and ROI. We'll talk a little bit about weeding, which is a topic that doesn't get nearly enough press as well. It's always important to keep your system fresh and have an asset lifecycle, so we'll talk about that a little bit. And then finally, what we do with our older assets, what we do for long-term storage. So let's get started with content creation and initial backup. So obviously, you're going to have content creators in your organization that are working on their own computers and that are backing up either on their own desktops or on an external drive, perhaps. Some, if you're doing a better practice, would be to work directly off the server if you can do that in terms of internet access, time lag, and that sort of thing. So you're going to have photographers creating photos, videographers creating video, writers creating documents, designers creating graphics and layouts, any type of content creator. And all of that information is going to be funneled into your on-site offline storage. So what should your on-site storage look like? Typically these days, the safest way to go is with something called RAID storage or RAID array. For those of you not familiar with what RAID is, it's basically a way to write data across multiple hard drives so that if one of your drives fails, you can replace it without losing any of your content. And another thing that's important to have is an uninterruptible power supply or a UPS. I have actually seen people lose data in lightning storms because of multiple lightning strikes. It actually happened to us. So it's very important to have that uninterruptible power supply, even if you have a RAID array to store all of your stuff. Now, in a perfect world, you would also have a redundant offsite storage backup. So that's something that's not going to be contained in your the location where you do your work, somewhere in another city or another town or even just another building, somewhere that's not close to where you are. This is for catastrophic things like floods or earthquakes or what have you. Obviously, in the perfect world, this doesn't always happen. It's obviously sometimes cost prohibitive to have that. But if you can do this, especially if you have a smaller collection, it's a really, really important and good thing to do. And sometimes, as I say over on the right there, you can configure your offsite backup automatically. So basically what that means is you can set it up as kind of a monitored folder so that anything that goes into your regular storage gets automatically copied to your offsite storage. I highly recommend that. That way you don't have to keep remembering to back up your backup. It just kind of happens automatically. So we'll move on to the second stage now, which is the editing and processing stage. So what are we talking about when we're talking about editing and processing assets? I'm going to talk today mostly about photography because that's what I know best. That's what we do here. That's what I do basically all day, every day. So for us, editing is the selection process for determining which assets will be ingested into the DAM or which photos. So again, this can apply to any type of material. But for photography, we basically have to decide, okay, are we going to ingest everything that we shoot? Or are we going to make a selection? Are we going to edit this down to only a few selected images that are going to go into our system for each shoot? How is this decision going to be made? So is it going to be the photographer that makes this decision? Is it going to be the photographer in collaboration with other people? So a lot of times you can get into discussions and arguments about what constitutes a good photo, for example, because it's a very subjective thing, and this can happen across any type of creative endeavor, obviously. So what we've developed at Cornell is this sort of three-tier selection process where first we have the photographer decide which images they like the best, and that's usually based on aesthetics. And then we have a second tier, which is me, the DAM administrator. So I will look at a shoot and I'll say, okay, you didn't select this photo and this photo, but they have faculty members in them that we don't have any images for in our DAM. So I'm going to take these ones too, even though they might not be the greatest photos. They're still important in terms of filling gaps that we have in our system. And then the third tier is our client. So often we will send an entire shoot out to a client with a contact sheet or just all of the assets at once and say, here's your shoot. You pick which ones that you like the best. And so what tends to end up as the selections in our DAM is the amalgamation of those three tiers of the selection process. Something to consider when you're doing this, what is your audience? So a lot of DAMs might be just simply internal DAMs, so it might be something that you only use within your office. It's not something that the public is logging into and looking at. In a case like that, you may have a policy where you upload everything because you want your designers to be able to see the widest array of content that you have. On the other hand, you may have a public-facing DAM where what you're really trying to do with your DAM is showcase your best photography or your best output. In a case like that, you may want to enhance that editing process, and you may not want to put in any of your outtakes. You might want to spend a little extra time editing down your content to make sure you just have the best content that's going in. And then part two of this is processing, which is the preparation of files for ingestion into your DAM. And again, this is going to be different based on what kind of material you're working with. But for photography, we do things like file renaming. We have a system of file naming so that you can tell when and where an image has been taken. We sometimes crop images to standardized sizes like 5x7, 8x10, that kind of thing. We do batch resizing, so we don't upload RAWs into our DAM because it's too storage cost prohibitive. They're too large. So we actually do a low-res batch of each shoot and we ingest that into our system. And then obviously repurposing, Photoshop work, and that type of thing. And so for that process, there are also considerations depending on who your client is, who you're sending these files to. So again, if you've got a public-facing DAM, you're probably only going to want to have your final repurposed Photoshopped assets in there. On the other hand, if your DAM is more of a collaborative environment with people at every stage of the process logging in for content, like your designers and so forth, that may not be as big of a consideration. And again, obviously, if you're sending images to your printer out of your DAM or having your printer log in to retrieve the files, then you're going to want to make sure that those are fully processed assets that they have access to. Metadata application. So we're going to move on now to the big topic for today, which is metadata, as it always is. And we're basically going to talk about who and how we ingest metadata into the DAM. First, obviously, who's going to do this for you? There's two basic approaches. One is to have a DAM administrator, somebody like me, who's responsible for overseeing this process. And the second is a collaborative metadata application process where obviously you have more than one person that is responsible for adding all of this metadata. Now there's pros and cons to both of these approaches. We'll go over a few of those now. Basically, for the first approach, it requires a full-time position with full-time responsibility and pay. This may or may not be a pro or a con depending on your budget. I've worked in a lot of places where it's simply not feasible to have a full-time DAM administrator. If that's your reality, that's fine. But it is recommended by me and by a lot of people in the industry to have this if you can. Why? Because when you have one person that is kind of the gatekeeper of your DAM, they get to know what your standards are, they get to know what your best practices are, and they're going to apply those things in a consistent way over the long term. They're going to be your single point of contact and knowledge. So not just for your internal users, but for your external users as well. You've got one person that you can always send them to and say, you know, this person's the expert on the DAM. Go ahead and talk to them. And this is a big one, at least it was for me, the accumulation and application of institutional knowledge. So in an environment like Cornell or like any large company or organization, it takes a while to get to know who the people are, who the stakeholders are, what kinds of things are more important than other kinds of things. And if you have this metadata application distributed, not all the people are going to know, for example, who all the faculty members are. They're not going to know them by sight. They're not going to know who the alumni, the important alumni, the donors are. They're not going to know who you know, your senior administration are necessarily. And then for each department or college within your school, then you're going to have deans and you're going to have you know, important staff members and so on. So this is the kind of thing that really allows you to tag your assets in a granular fashion, which is really what makes you be able to locate them more efficiently and more quickly. So if you don't have this institutional knowledge, or if it's very diffuse, that can, you know, make your searching and so forth a lot less efficient. Now, looking at the other approach, the collaborative approach, it has pros and cons as well. Again, it does not require a full-time position, which again may or may not be a pro or a con. There's less responsibility on that one single person, and that also means that if that person leaves for whatever reason, your organization, it's not going to be as big a hit to the administration of your DAM if you've got it distributed. This approach does require a more strict adherence to taxonomy and vocabulary. Why? Because you're going to have a whole array of people that are going to be inputting data, and they may not be conceiving of things in exactly the same ways at all times. So you're not going to want to have any fields in your DAM with basic text entry where people can just type in whatever they want. You're going to basically want to lock that down and control every metadata field with drop-down values or checkboxes or whatever to make sure that people are entering data in a systematic way. And of course, it requires ongoing training for new users. So, you know, if you've only got one DAM administrator, they're really the only person that's going to need to know a lot of the functions. If you've got it distributed, every time you've got a new person that wants to use the DAM, you've basically got to train them for it. And adherence to your standards and practices is less likely. So again, depending on how well you are at locking down your vocabulary and your taxonomy, this might not be an issue. But a lot of, I see so many dam systems in so many different states of standardization or complexity or completion, that a lot of times this can get out of control very quickly. So then let's talk a little bit about how exactly you apply your metadata. So again, there are two approaches to how to do this. One is embedded, which basically means that your metadata is going to actually be inside the asset itself, and it's going to travel with that asset. And then the second one is your system applied metadata, which basically means that you are uploading your assets into your DAM first, and then you're applying your metadata later. And again, there are various pros and cons to each approach. We'll talk about the embedded metadata approach first. This is the one that I prefer. Again, I'll talk about why, but the big one is that your metadata will travel with your asset regardless of whether it's online or offline. So in photography, we have what's called raw files, and those are the photos that are taken by the camera. It's called raw because it's not a compressed format. So basically, the camera takes a snapshot, and all the possible data that is contained in that snapshot is in the raw file. The images that you see on the web or in print are not nearly as large as that raw file is, and they're compressed or they've been processed in some way. So usually when you want to repurpose a photograph, you have to go back to that raw file, pull it, and you want to start working with that one because it's basically like the original full-size image that hasn't been tampered with in any way. So a lot of times what will happen is we'll get a request for an image, and our Photoshop guy will have to go back into our storage and pull the raw file instead of going to the DAM and pulling one of the repurposed files. If he does that and you haven't embedded your metadata in those raw files, then he could end up sending a repurposed photo out without any metadata. That's not something that you want. So embedding your metadata in your raw files is a good idea. Depending on your internet speeds, application can be faster than doing it offline than doing it online. I certainly find that I can apply my metadata a lot faster in Adobe Bridge, for example, than I can even doing batch processing within my DAM. So if speed is an issue, as it is here, that can definitely be an asset. A lot of times I get the question, well, if I embed my metadata offline and then I upload my images into the DAM, do I then have to enter that metadata again? Obviously, the answer to that is no. Any DAM worth its salt is going to have the ability to take those embedded metadata fields that you have in Bridge or whatever application you're using to embed and map them to your existing metadata fields in your DAM. So what happens in that case is that the DAM basically auto-populates all of your metadata fields during the upload, which is great. Some possible cons: it does require the use of third-party tools. For example, I use Adobe Bridge to embed metadata. I think Lightroom can do it. I'm sure there are other applications out there that can do it, depending on what type of documents you might be working with. It does require a bit of a higher level of technical expertise. You're going to have to familiarize yourself with things like Bridge templates, how to map your fields from Bridge to your DAM. You're also going to have a really good grasp of the metadata values that are in your DAM because they won't map properly unless they're exact. So it really pays to have that sort of advanced knowledge when you're doing your tagging offline. And then there's the other approach, which is your system applied metadata. This also has some pros. You don't require any sort of third-party tools. This might not seem like a big deal, but I actually have been in a number of environments where third-party software could be prohibitively expensive, or they've committed themselves to open source, or whatever you have. So that can be a pro. Metadata can be applied online from anywhere, so that's actually quite a big pro. When you're doing it offline, you kind of have to have a big setup with usually multiple screens and more than one application open at a time. Whereas if you're doing it in your system, you can just log in anytime you have an internet connection, you can populate your metadata. And users can use your controlled vocabulary fields like your drop-downs and buttons and so on, and they don't have to really know what the values are in advance. So if you're just applying the metadata in your DAM, all those values are already there. You don't have to know what they are in advance to apply them. Now, there are ways to duplicate those drop-down values and so forth in Adobe Bridge. Again, it's a little bit technically advanced, but you can take time and create that if you know a little XML. And if you can create your own metadata templates in Bridge and get your DAM administrators to help you map those if it's worth your while. This approach can be more time-consuming dependent on your internet speeds, obviously, and internet access, which I talked about before. And again, your metadata may not travel with the asset. So basically, you're applying the metadata after it's already been ingested into your DAM. So whatever's in your storage is probably not, does not have your metadata embedded in it. There are some DAMs that can embed metadata on the way out. So for example, if you've applied the metadata in the system and then you're sending an image to someone through your DAM, or you're downloading it or exporting it in some way, the system can usually embed that metadata as it goes out, which is great, but it still doesn't solve the problem of your storage not having embedded metadata. So let's move on a little bit here. We're going to get to the ingestion, uploading your images or your assets into the DAM. Now, we talked a little bit about applying metadata within the DAM, but we're going to assume for now that you've done your embedding offline and you're going to now ingest your images into the DAM. There are a number of approaches and considerations, again, when you're doing this. I get a lot of questions about ingestion when people are first implementing their system, usually. So they have this gigantic, usually a hard drive or a server or something that has a bunch of images or assets on it, and they want to just get those things in the system as fast as they possibly can so that everyone can search for them and find them. Normally, that's not the greatest idea, just because chances are that they are not named according to any type of convention. Chances are that they don't have any metadata associated with them. So just uploading them like that is really no different from having them on your hard drive. So basically, when you have that implementation and you're ready to go, there's basically two workflows that I recommend for people. The first is going to be a large batch ingestion, which would basically be you do upload all of those images in there, but you upload them into what I would call an in-DAM Dropbox or a holding folder. And what that is it's usually a folder or a category that's invisible to everybody except for the DAM administrator. And you can use that as sort of a organizational area where you tag images and categorize images and then move them out of that folder as you go, decreasing obviously the number of images you have in there as you go, with the goal of eventually getting rid of that folder altogether. The other option obviously is to do an integrated or controlled ingestion, which is where you basically say, we're not going to ingest anything until its metadata is populated and we know where it's going to go. Obviously, that's going to take longer to do because you're going to have to add all that metadata. You're going to have to rename your assets and so forth before you begin. But the bonus of that is that you know that when you have those assets in the DAM, they're ready to go. They don't have empty metadata fields. They're not floating around without a category. They're basically fully vested assets that are ready to go. Now, a couple other approaches, things that have been added to DAM systems in the recent past. People are starting to do integrations with cloud storage accounts, things like Box, Dropbox, Google Drive. A lot of marketing departments I know use these tools to get content from outside sources. You might have freelance photographers, for example, or outside designers that are helping you with stuff. You can set your DAM up to monitor your account in Box, Dropbox, or Google Drive, or what have you, and basically ingest anything that goes in there into your DAM. And again, you probably want to have an in-DAM Dropbox or holding folder set up so that you can vet those assets before they become available to everyone. And then your basic DAM tools, and these are things that exist usually in every DAM system. Things like drag and drop areas where basically, if you have your assets with embedded metadata ready to go, you can just drag and drop them and it'll upload immediately. A lot of systems have upload wizards that will guide you through the process of categorization and metadata application during the upload process. So that's great for people who are starting out and they're not quite sure, what metadata they need to add and so forth. It's also great for that more distributed collaborative work environment that I talked about earlier. And then just basic monitored folders, which works the same as what I talked about with the storage accounts online, which would mean that you would just have the DAM monitor folder either on your server or on your local system, and it would auto-ingest assets that were in there. And this is just kind of my mantra. I really like to drive this home to everybody I speak to, that assets without metadata are just taking up space. That's why I recommend the controlled ingestion process. Even if it's nice to have those assets in there, the ones that have no metadata, depending on how many you have, it's going to be really difficult even to browse through those assets in any sort of controlled way. So really make an effort to get the metadata into those assets quickly if you do choose to do a large batch, or just embed them all and go with the ingestion process, the controlled process. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about something that gets jumped over by a lot of people, which is metadata verification. Now, why would you need to do this? This is the process by which you make sure that all your metadata got into your system the way you thought it was going to get into your system. And the reason that I say that you should do this is because there are a lot of little things that can go wrong in that process of mapping. You can have changes to your system. So basically you want to make sure that everything mapped correctly, that you're not missing any values. Sometimes you just skip over a metadata field when you're embedding in Bridge and you don't realize it until you've uploaded your assets and you're like, wait a minute, I have an empty field. So then you can put that in. And this is especially important after system changes or upgrades. So as many of you probably know, DAM systems are extremely complex pieces of software. And sometimes you can go through a change or an upgrade and you fix one thing and then another thing breaks inadvertently or unintentionally. So it's important to just make sure after an upgrade that everything is still working the way you expect it to. And of course, once your metadata is verified, you can go ahead and deliver your assets to your clients or make them available in your DAM, whatever it is that you're doing with them. And that's basically the end of what I would call the initial workflow process, which is from the conception of, say, a project or a shoot to the delivery. And now we're going to move on to the other three smaller topics, which I wanted to talk about, which are processes that take place after that initial DAM workflow. And these are sort of things that you come back to your DAM for later on in the game. The first is repurposing and versioning. This is often the very reason that people set their DAMs up in the first place, so that they can repurpose their assets, reuse them, increase their value and their return on investment. It can be a real good cornerstone of your return on investment, especially if you have analytics set up and you can tell who's using your assets and what they're using them for and so on. And different DAMs handle versioning in different ways. So I've seen, there's a lot of variation in between DAM systems in terms of how they deal with repurposing and versioning. Usually, repurposed assets can either be additive versions of an existing asset or as an entirely new asset, and there's pros and cons to both of those. So usually what happens in our workflow is we repurpose an asset, we go to upload it to the DAM, and if it has the same file name as the original asset, the DAM will say, wait a minute, you already have an asset with this file name in your system. What do you want to do? And at that point, you have the option of renaming that asset, which basically would mean it would turn it into a totally new asset, or you can create it as a version of the existing asset. Now, when you create it as a version, usually it will copy the metadata over from the original. Usually when you rename it, it does not copy that metadata over. Now, this may be different in your system. As I said, there's a lot of variation, Basically, what you want to do is you want to have the option of what to do both with the name of your asset and with the metadata of your original. So if you're in the market for a DAM system, this is an area that you might want to take a close look at because it can save you a lot of time in the long run. Ideally, what you would want to do is be able to create it as a new asset, but also copy the metadata over. Some systems will be able to do this. Some systems may not be able to do this. Again, it's just something that is in need of development in a lot of systems. And another very important thing, repurposed versions should be copied back to your offline storage. This is something that I almost never see anyone do and is very important for saving your time. As I talked about earlier, our Photoshop guy will often just go straight to our storage to pull a file for repurposing. He may not know that that same file has already been repurposed and is in the DAM. So what you want to do is, if you copy your repurposed versions back there, when he goes into that folder, he's going to say, oh, look, somebody already repurposed this file. Maybe I repurposed this file in the past. I can just pull this one, and I don't have to redo all my Photoshop work. I can just send this one out as is, which is a huge time saver, cost saver. It has many advantages, but a lot of times it's missing in people's workflow. Another aspect of DAM management that people overlook a lot is your asset lifecycle, or weeding images out. I've worked in libraries, I've worked in museums, I've worked in marketing. Everybody gets horrified when you talk about deleting content or removing content from your DAM, but it's an essential part of your workflow, and it's something that you'll run up against at some point, depending, as you go along with your system. You'll want to take stuff out, it'll get old. There are many reasons to do this. So basically, you want to create an asset lifecycle policy or procedure that is in accordance with your mission. That's a good guideline. And then these are some other reasons why you should weed. Keeping your content fresh. Obviously, if you're in marketing, older assets lose their marketability. So you may want to go through some of your older assets periodically and say, okay, well, we'll keep that one, we won't keep this one, depending on how much time you have. You may have a lot of redundant content in your DAM. I mentioned before that we sometimes upload entire shoots and send them out to clients or to our designers. Sometimes a photographer will go out and they will shoot 20 frames of the exact same thing, and they fail to edit those things out before they get to me. So we could have all of that stuff in our DAM when it really doesn't need to be there. We've chosen the best one from that series, the rest can go. Too many assets for users to search through efficiently. Obviously, depending on your metadata application methods and how complete your metadata is, that's what's going to determine how easily you can find your assets. The more assets you have, the more difficult it's going to be to apply that granular metadata, because it's going to take a lot of time. So if you can decrease the amount of assets in your system, you'll have more time to tag what you do have in your system in a more granular fashion, which will enable people to find things better. And obviously there's storage concerns. So most DAM systems now are web-based. You are usually storing your images in the cloud. You can run into storage problems if you're uploading things like raw video or huge raw files. So you don't want to be taking up storage space that you don't need to be taking up with assets that nobody is using. So just to give you an example of Cornell's asset lifecycle policy, basically we upload everything into the DAM for a period of 5 years. After that 5-year period, we remove all of the outtakes from our system. The selected images will stay in for another 5 years, which is a total of 10 years. So our best images stay in there for 10 years. The not-so-great images come out after 5. And then after 10 years, we shift everything to our university archives, which is based in the library. You may not have the luxury of offloading your assets to another organization at some point. Basically, your approach at that point would be deep storage, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Long-term deep storage. So again, there are various options for this. This is going to be the storage of your older content, your historical content, content that you're not going to be accessing very often, you could do it locally with the same way that you do your regular storage with a RAID array or something like that. There's online deep storage options now, things like Amazon Glacier, where basically you get a discounted price on your storage if you only access it a certain number of times over a certain period of time. Basically discounted storage. Or you can transfer it to an archive, a historical archive. Maybe your organization has some sort of historical department within it or what have you. So those are some options for you. Again, about metadata, remember, if you're applying your metadata in your system, make sure that your archived assets have your metadata. So what you don't want to happen is you ingest your assets, you add all the metadata in your system, and then when it's time to take them out, you export them, and then you lose all of that metadata that you applied. Not what you want. So at this point, this is where you would want to make sure that your system has the ability to embed the metadata on the way out, or you could export your metadata to a CSV file, an Excel file, something like that, and archive that with the assets. I'm pretty sure that every system that I've come across at least has the ability to do that, if not to actually embed on the way out. So now I'm going to show you a second workflow, and this is very similar to what we've gone through over the course of the presentation, but in this particular workflow, I'm going to insert approvals kind of at every stage of the process. And this workflow is something I call DAM as a hub. Basically, your DAM system is going to sit at the center of your organization, and at every stage, people are going to interact through the DAM. So you have your content producers ingesting images into your DAM. You then have somebody who's approving the ingestion of those images or vetting those images, either within the DAM or if they wish, they could download them and then re-upload them. Not sure exactly why you would do that. But then you're going to have people doing your processing and your editing. So once those images are vetted, the processor or editor can go and retrieve them from the DAM, maybe weed out the ones that you don't want to ingest. Again, you're going to get, you may have another approval process for your project that you're working on. Maybe somebody is selecting images for design work. Then the designer can come back into the DAM, pull those chosen assets, do their design work, re-upload her content, and then your final approval will again occur through the DAM, after which it can be sent out to the client. So this is a very precise workflow. It's something that would probably take a lot of education within your organization. You're going to have to change people's workflows, change people's work habits, which is not an easy thing, but really this is what DAMs are designed to do. They're designed to be not just the repository of your content, but the place where you interact and track what stage of the process any of your assets are at any particular time. What you don't want to happen, that I see happening all the time, is this kind of thing going around the outside. So you don't want your photographers giving things straight to your processor or straight to your designer and circumventing the DAM. When you do that, things get lost. Metadata gets lost, approvals get lost. Sometimes people end up pulling assets that are not approved or assets that haven't been repurposed or optimized in some way. So that's basically it. Use the DAM as your hub. You can't go wrong. As promised, here's all my contact information. Feel free to contact me at any time. I think we're going to proceed to questions now. So let's see. First question. Do you think that it would work to start out with a collaborative approach and then add an admin later after the system grows? Sure. There's no reason why you can't mesh the two together. A lot of times you may have, say, I see a lot of people use interns, for example, college interns, especially here at Cornell, to do basic things like maybe resizing or renaming of assets and then uploading to one of those holding folders that I talked about, and then you have your DAM administrator go in and do the metadata. Absolutely, that would be a fine workflow. And of course, at any stage of the process, you're constantly improving. Even if you are a dam manager, there are going to be things that you want to change about your system in the future. So you're always going to be in this kind of zone where you're going to have some assets that you're always going to want to go back and revisit. So I don't want this to sound like, if you follow all of these rules, then your dam is going to be perfect, because that's totally not the case. There's no such thing as a perfect dam. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any dam that has 100% metadata application in it. In the real world, it doesn't tend to happen. So basically what you just want to do is use the resources that you have to the best of your ability and try to stick to standards and practices as much as you can. How do you teach your users about the policies in place? So one of the things that we do is we have our policies downloadable from our dam itself. We have what's called a helpful documents category in the system. Anyone can go in there, have a look at the policies at any time. Anytime we implement a new policy or we change an existing policy, we have a system messages area, which is on the dashboard of our dam. So as soon as any user logs in, that's the first thing they see. And we will, promote those changes or make people aware of those changes that way. And then obviously, if you are talking about training people on how to actually use your dam and what the policies are in terms of ingestion and the intricacies of applying your metadata and so forth, that's obviously going to take a little bit more time. You're probably going to have to sit down and do a training. A lot of the dam vendors out there will provide you with support or with training materials. They'll have online training materials and online forums and things like that. All of those tools can be used to inform your users. Who drafted your dam policies, and how did you come to agreement on how things should work? So I was kind of lucky. I came in at a time when we already had a dam in place that was not working out. I probably was in a position where anything that I did was going to be better than what they had already. And we didn't have a lot of people in. We had a group of people who understood that we needed a system where they could search for photos efficiently, but none of them really had any dam experience or any dam training. So I was lucky in that respect. All I really had to do was outline what I thought the best practices should be, and if they made sense, if they seemed reasonable, and if they didn't go against existing policy or existing workflows, then it wasn't too tough for me to get approval for that. One of the things that if you're in a tougher environment, one of the things that you can do that goes a long way is read up about how to measure return on investment for digital asset management. It's something that is not the easiest thing in the world. It's difficult sometimes to figure out what the value of your assets is, but if you can articulate that in a way that makes sense to managers or investors, obviously, the discussion of, well, how is this going to save us money and how is this going to be valuable, that's the thing that you can really use to sell what you want to do. You mentioned that you don't store raw images in the dam because of storage costs, but you recommend using those for processing. Doesn't this reduce the value of dam if you can't store those raw images? Not really. Basically, we have a proxy for every one of those raw images that is in the system. Most people can't do anything with a raw file anyway, unless you're a designer or somebody or a Photoshop person. But the vast majority of our users are looking for either press-ready content or web-ready content. So they're looking for, CMYK TIFFs, or they're looking for JPEGs that they can use on the web. So the cost of storing those raw files is not worth it for us to store them directly in the dam. If we were an internal shop where we were all designers and we were accessing those, all of us were accessing the raw files at all times, it might be worth it for us to do that. But as it is, we really only have one person in the office that needs to work with those raw files. And so it works a lot better for us to use low-res JPEGs as previews. That way we can actually present all our content to the public and to our users, and they can actually download and use those files. Do you have any thoughts about using XMP versus IPTC? My thoughts about the whole metadata standardization movement are less than stellar, shall we say. It's very confusing at this point, and most times when you go to map fields from Bridge or another program into your system, you're probably going to need the assistance of a programmer from your DAM vendor, because all of these standards have become conflated in many instances. They use similar field names, and a lot of times those field names will not match up to the field names that you're using in your DAM. So my recommendation actually is to, if you have the expertise and the time, is to develop your own standard that adheres to whatever your system is, to use your own field names and your own values. Our fields tend to be a mix of XMP and IPTC because neither one of them provides everything that we need. So we do use the IPTC metadata panel in Bridge to enter our metadata, but a lot of the fields end up having to be mapped as XMP fields in our DAM. Don't ask me why. It even confuses me at points. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Do you have a file naming convention? If so, how does that tie into your metadata schema? We do have a file naming convention. Our system requires that file names not be duplicated, so we do a naming system that isn't going to repeat, so we base it on the date. Basically, it's a year, shoot number, and frame number as a total. And in terms of our metadata schema, it doesn't really have any bearing on the metadata other than that's just what the file name is. We embed the file names in all of our images so that we can track them back if we send them out and somebody changes the file name on us, or if somebody just pulls one off a website or something and says, hey, do you have this photo? We embed the file name so that we can then open that image up in Photoshop, go to the file info, and we can always get back to what the original file name was. So that's important for us. You recommend weeding out older content, but isn't the storage of and accessibility to older content one of the values of DAM? Yeah, absolutely it is. But you have to draw a distinction between content being old and content being invaluable. We have a lot of marquee type older images, even stuff going as far back as the 60s or even the 19th century in some cases. In fact, Cornell is having its sesquicentennial this year, so we're actually using a lot of our historical content. What I'm talking about in getting rid of the older content is really you're getting rid of the older content that you're not using, not the older content that you are using. And this is, of course, where your analytics is going to come in to help you see, which assets are actually being accessed, which are being used. And of course, you can always just use your own judgment as well. Like if you have a particular image, even if it's not being used, if you think that it's historically significant, there's no reason that you can't keep it in your DAM. But you probably don't need, 40 identical portrait headshots of the same professor in there. You're probably going to want to pick one or two and then do away with the rest. When you transfer older assets to university storage, are they still findable by your DAM users? Yes and no. Our library has its own systems for accessing digital content on the web. I'm not 100% familiar with how they make their assets available, or if they make them all available. I know they do not use the same system that we use. So when you say DAM users, basically that could be anyone. People can't log into our DAM and find that older content necessarily, because we don't want people requesting things that we don't have. Basically, we make people aware of our 10-year policy, and then we send them to the archives. At that point, it's up to the archives what they want to do with that material. If it behooves them to make that content available and put in the time and the effort, then I suppose that will become available through them. But we don't help them with that after they leave our office. How much automation do you rely upon in your DAM workflows? Not a huge amount. Really, the only automatic stuff that happens for me is the population of our metadata through the mapping when I upload. We have a pretty tight control on what we allow to go into our DAM, so we don't have any of the monitored folder kind of things happening like with Dropbox or a monitored folder, because we don't ingest content that isn't produced by our department. So we don't have outside people sending us content all the time. So none of that is actually automated. Usually, if something that has to go into the DAM that wasn't shot by one of our photographers, it has to be basically vetted first, and we have to get things like copyright information and so on before we can actually ingest that. So we don't have very much automation in our particular workflow, just because we need to control that. What analytics do you feel are most helpful for generating user or asset data? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by user or asset data, but we do track things like how many users we have in the system, how many logins we get per day and over time, like which users are logging in the most. We track asset downloads, asset shares, obviously total number of assets in the system. So we have a I guess a basic spreadsheet of data that we track over time. Basically, what we're looking at, we want to have a steady increase in our user base, and we want to have a steady increase in the number of images that are being viewed and downloaded. Those are probably two of the biggest analytics that I use regularly to justify what I'm doing with the system. How do you discourage users from storing files locally? We have a cloud DAM, and I hear users say that it's just faster to use local files. Part of that is policy. We have basically a policy that nobody is supposed to work locally, with the exception of our video group, who need to work locally precisely because of those speed issues. But because of the possibility of hard drive crashes and so on, everyone else is required to work off either a external RAID device attached to their local computer or directly off of one of our storage servers. And it's a basic security practice that we require people to follow so that we don't lose content. It may be a little bit slower, it's true, but in the long run, I'd rather things take a little bit longer than lose my work completely. So that's kind of the mantra that we try to employ. Does Cornell have just one DAM, or do you work with another system too? If you have more than one, are the systems integrated? So this is actually one of my pet peeves at Cornell, is that it's a gigantic campus with a lot of distributed departments and so forth. It's very decentralized. We do have more than one system at Cornell. Our system is basically for marketing photos, and then there is also a marketing video system based on Kaltura, and then we also have, I guess, whatever the library is using. I think they have a multitude of different systems that they're using. So yes, we do have we do have more than one, and no, at this point they do not talk to each other. Although I have made efforts personally to make sure that the systems that we are using are, I guess, open source enough to be able to integrate at some point in the future. I like to make sure that we can export things in XML and that sort of thing, so that if we ever have to come into alignment with library records or with some other type of file, we can actually do that. Our DAM is hosted on our own network, so there is no significant cost to us to increase storage. We rely on metadata editing to make sure older content doesn't get mixed with the new stuff. Would you still recommend that we clear out older stuff? I suppose it's up to you. I mean, you may not have increases to storage, but the more imagery and so forth that you get, the more content that you get, at a certain point, it's going to be difficult to manage that large of a collection, just in terms of like managing the sheer number of assets that you have. But no, I mean, I suppose that if it's a personal decision that you have to make. I mean, I'm in marketing, so we tend to get rid of older content because it loses its marketability. If you were in a research environment, or you were in a historical preservation environment, then obviously, you probably would not want to get rid of your old content. It might even be the most valuable content that you have. So it kind of just depends on your own setup. Okay, I think that is the end of the questions. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and my invitations are still open. Please feel free to contact me, and have a wonderful afternoon.